Howdy folks, today we're looking at Rogues #1 from 2022 in DC Comics Black Label. The Flash's Rogues Gallery has always been a unique institution in comics. Whereas characters like Batman and Spider-Man possess similarly large assortments of villains, they're rarely team players. Sinister Six notwithstanding, that's always been portrayed more as a temporary alliance of convenience, and so too anytime any of Batman's major baddies decide to call a parley. Almost always just a prelude to some manner of double-cross. The Flash's bad guys, however, have always been more of a family, a literal family in some respects, given the connection between Captain Cold and the Golden Glider. Barring, of course, rank sociopaths like Reverse Flash and world beaters like Gorilla Grodd, Flash's bad guys have long recognized the virtue of strength in numbers and teamwork. Not to preclude the occasional betrayal, these are villains after all. There's still a sense of camaraderie stemming from the fact that the best way to outfight a man who can put you in jail in the blink of an eye is simply to gang up and hope for the best. Joshua Williamson's script for Rogues begins with this dynamic at its core. If most villains are portrayed as lone wolves, the Flash's rogues need each other. This story picks up in 10 years' time. The rogues have all been pinched and paroled out to some semblance of regular lives. Captain Cold works at a box factory. Golden Glider's a social worker. Heatwave is maybe still working the wrong side of the law, but he was always a little bit less sane than the others. Fact is, whatever their occupation, without each other they're completely dysfunctional people, at least in their own eyes. When Snart gets frustrated with his day job and wants back into the big time, he ropes in the old gang for one last score, only minus the deceased Captain Boomerang and Weather Wizard. In their place we have Magenta and Bronze Tiger, one a Flash frenemy who never really consorted with the old rogues, and another more famous for his association with the Suicide Squad. Add a past his prime trickster slumming as a stage magician and petty con man and a drug-addled mirror master sentenced to rehab, and the rogues live again, and this time the target's none other than the aforementioned Grodd himself, a rogue who always considered himself better than to consort with mere thieves and killers, with a giant pile of gold all to himself. Williamson's script hits all the beats you want from a one last score caper. The relative squalor of the rogues' latter-day accommodations is leavened with dark humor throughout. The real appeal, however, is the art by Italian illustrator Leo Max. The Black Label album format gives the proceedings a definite European cast, with a focus on character expression and mise-en-scene that makes every page a pleasure to pore over. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Steel Town Rockers #4 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. The saga continues as the group finally manages their first gig, at the bowling alley where Sid's mother works. Of course, they almost don't make it. Johnny's dad, still soaking his troubles in alcohol, totals the family car without even leaving the garage, forcing them to make do with Jace's parents' Volvo. The excitement and nerves of that first gig dissipate fast in that cloud of anxiety. And all that before Adora shows up, because of course the band needs a singer, don't they? Sid takes an immediate dislike to the woman, which frankly isn't that unreasonable since the rest of the band stops in their tracks to pay attention to the new cute girl who wants to come in at the last minute and hog the spotlight. It doesn't help that literally her first act in the book is to back into Sid and break her best read right before the show. Never a good idea to antagonize the saxophone player. Meanwhile, Johnny's on the warpath, getting into a meaningless pissing match with the lead guitarist over absolutely nothing whatsoever. Eduardo's twice the player Johnny is. Problem is, he knows it, but what he doesn't know is just how quickly Johnny's family life is falling apart from the stress of his unemployed and besotted dad. Ultimately, despite the drama, the show goes off without a hitch. About as good a debut as you could hope for a high school band playing the bowling alley circuit. Only the presence of Adora threatens to bring other longer simmering resentments to boil. It'd be a tragedy if it weren't so familiar. Sid and Johnny started the band together. Sid and Johnny have shared a great deal, but Johnny doesn't have a clue how Sid feels about him and isn't likely to now that Adora's on the scene. Elaine Lee's script continues not to pull any punches. The continuing deterioration of Johnny's home life continues to drag on his best hope for the future, creating ripples of antagonism across the rest of the band. Under Steve Leialoha's pen, the quietest moments are also revealed to be the most devastating. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Route #2 from 1993 in Malibu Comics. The Ultraverse marches on with Barry Windsor Smith's great contribution to this sorely lamented early 90s superhero universe. This is a violent and bloody series, and even if it didn't last for long, was nevertheless Windsor Smith's last monthly work intended for the newsstand audience, Storyteller being a direct market magazine. That's an interesting aspect here, given how much of his work, especially later in his career, was essentially created at its own pace, or at least a relaxed pace relative to the rest of the industry. Here we see the artist working fast, eschewing much in the way of detail in favor of speed. This is a comic that moves fast without so much in the way of exposition or lyrical detail. People are in a hurry. Whether they know it or not, they're all playing by Rune's timetable, and he's about the least patient creature in the universe. He's also safely ensconced in the heart of Aladdin's great computer, learning all the secrets of the shadowy government agency that had thought him a captive subject. Of course, this being the Ultraverse precious little here was ever actually paid off. The great tragedy of this line was the promise that everything had been worked out well in advance by a team of expert creatives, Bronze Age veterans from across the industry, alongside sci-fi legend Larry Niven. And of course, what actually happened was that the whole operation was bought by Marvel, and all those well-laid plans turned out to be so much kindling once the characters crossed over with the Marvel Universe. Still, for what it was, Rune was nothing less than a minor miracle, a last noble attempt by Windsor Smith to fit what he could do into a box meant for popular consumption. The results here, a nasty, bloody yarn built around the appetites of a truly distinctive monster, speak for themselves. Of special note is the coloring, garish and striking in equal measure, supernal and nauseating both. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Arcade #1 from 1975 in the print mint. The mid-70s was a strange time for the world of so-called alternative comics. The underground explosion that had produced so much work in the late 60s was dying, shorn of a true distribution system and detached from a cultural moment that had run its course. There was no next step for those cartoonists, no publishers or channels for the likes of Crumb and Gilbert Shelton and Spain Rodriguez. Arcade was conceived as a kind of life raft for that generation of cartoonists, even if in hindsight it can be seen as more of a stepping stone to the next paradigm. Not coincidentally, the two editors, Art Spiegelman and Bill Griffith, were two of the artists most concerned with finding new commercial berths for this material. When the magazine goes away after 7 issues, it's partly because Spiegelman is in New York, where he would eventually create Raw, which in turn became the most influential comics magazine of the 1980s. Griffith, on the other hand, managed the neat trick of converting his venerable Zippy into a newspaper strip, the only one of the underground generation to make any headway into what we might now call legacy media, with their own strips, although not the only one of that generation to find employment in the field. But the post-Arcade careers of Spiegelman and Griffith both point ineradicably to the fact that Arcade was both ahead of and behind the times. There was no real retail model for a magazine like this. This ran concurrent to Marvel's Comics book, for instance, another notable failure that sought to find a new foothold for artists orphaned by the death of the head shop circuit. Despite a stacked lineup, cover and center sped by R. Crumb, work by Jay Lynch, Kim Deitch, Justin Green, and so many others from the era, no one bought it. There's still a root in the rough-and-tumble 60s counterculture, which means taking the good with the bad in a lot of respects. You've got Aileen Kaminsky and Diane Newman crowding out the back pages, barely an afterthought, rubbing elbows with some of Crumb's diciest racial caricatures. You can see, certainly, the rudimentary outlines of what would come later. In the evolutionary lineup between Zap and Raw, this is the middle fish, the guy who still has gills but's figuring out how to walk on those fins, because there's more food on the land. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Conan the Barbarian #127 from 1981 in Marvel Comics. It has come to my attention that I haven't been featuring as much Gil Kane on this channel as I'd like. I regret the omission, as wanting to talk about Kane at depth has long been one of my guiding motivations as a critic. Take this issue of Conan, for instance, one of my favorite Kane jobs and typical of the virtues I associate with the man's work. He did a small run on the character around this time, part of which was written by James DeMatteis during the latter's tumultuous tenure on the Cimmerian's title. He didn't get on well with the character despite being a fan, this from his own admission, but it's hard not to argue that he figured out the right balance here, with Kane as able collaborator. In the first place, this is Kane inking himself. No one should ever have been allowed near Kane's pencils but the man himself. His ink line is simply sublime, both controlled and casual. You can almost see his hand at work, with every image carrying the stamp of the man's style as if it were handwriting. The issue begins with a fight with the polar bear here, raw and desperate as anything you can imagine. Kane's influence is wide across the entire range of the industry, but lately I am taken by just how much of a direct predecessor he was for so many artists of the Image generation, even if at a remove, filtered through the likes of Miller. He could draw better than almost anyone else to ever do it, was arguably a better draftsman than even the likes of Kirby or Kubert, and he never stopped trying to show off what he could do. You can see that even in a single-issue yarn with Conan fighting a polar bear and meeting a strange woman in the Arctic wastes. He just didn't have it in him not to draw technically perfect and stylistically daring comic book art at every turn. Howdy folks, today we're looking at DC's new facsimile edition of Batman 181 from 1966. This is the first appearance of Poison Ivy, one of Batman's most popular and enduring rogues, enough so that it might be difficult to classify her as a rogue in 2023. Things were far less ambiguous in the mid-60s. While it seems on the face of it that the character must have been designed to capitalize on the tone of the 60s television show, the publication date reveals this issue hit stands barely 4 months after the premiere of that August program. What we have here is still an object of transition. The Batman books were technically still in the midst of their mid-decade attempt to shake off the cobwebs, with the new look symbolized by the yellow insignia and updated art. But as we all know, the runaway success of the TV show scuppered contemporary attempts to modernize the Dark Knight and his milieu. That was a process eventually resumed in the early 70s, after a few years spent chasing the tone of the wildly successful adaptation. What Poison Ivy does represent was the gradual reintroduction of sex appeal to the Batman books. Remember, Catwoman had been banned by the Comics Code in 1954 and wouldn't return until later in 1966. In her first appearance, frankly, it's difficult to tell just what Poison Ivy's doing, besides being sexy. Her criminal scheme, such as it is, amounts to kissing boys and trying to get other crooks pinched. Not precisely a great scheme in the annals of crime. Any intimation of environmental themes, to say nothing at all of queerness, would have to await the long decades of her gradual development. But return she did because she was a pretty girl in a skin-tight leotard. Too late in the scheme of things to make it onto the 1966 TV show, but a staple of the 90s cartoon and most adaptations since. Sheldon Moldoff draws the main story here, written by Robert Conagher, but don't sleep on the backup, written by the slightly less unconscious Gardner Fox, a rare appearance of the mystery analyst of Gotham City, a seldom-seen social club of crime solvers. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Destroyer Duck No. 1 from 1982 and Eclipse Comics. Strange as it may seem on first glance, this is nothing less than one of the most important comic books of the 1980s, a proverbial shot heard around the world in many more ways than one. In the first place, this represents the only collaboration between two of the most storied creators in the medium's history, Steve Gerber and Jack Kirby himself, coming together for 5 issues of all-out mayhem. The purpose behind this pairing was grim, paying for Steve Gerber's lawsuit against Marvel Comics for the ownership of Howard the Duck. This was a cause close to the king's heart, as someone who was himself estranged from the company and soon to be embroiled in his own legal struggle against the erstwhile House of Ideas. Kirby had already made a triumphant return to comics the previous year with the creator-owned Captain Victory series, which had sold surprisingly well for fellow upstart Pacific Comics. This is a rough book, bitter and mean in a way only hinted in some of Kirby's 70s material, rueful to the bone and stringently anti-corporate. Another interesting aspect of the book is the inking on the main feature by Alfredo Alcala, not a name usually associated with Kirby. Alcala was famously a texture guy, often utilized for horror or fantasy. Kirby, for all his many acknowledged strengths, wasn't an artist with a great feel for texture, so the combination is different and striking. The increasing abstraction of later Kirby is grounded throughout by Alcala's detail feathering, making for a unique book in both men's bibliographies, a stylistic crossover that doesn't always work, but is never less than interesting. But the book doesn't stop there. In addition to a couple satirical, semi-fictional episodes from comic book history provided by the teams of Mark Evanier and Dan Spiegel, as well as Marty Pasco, Joe Staton, and Scott Shaw, there's a 2-page spread from Sherry Flanagan, a survivor of the underground scene and part-time air pirate, who somehow herself narrowly managed to avoid being sued by Disney in the early 70s. However, the most significant strip in the book would inarguably be the 4-page gag strip in the back by the legendary Sergio Aragonés, the first appearance of his own beloved creation, the inimitable Gru the Wanderer. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Rogues No. 2 from 2022 and DC's Black Label. The fun continues as the Flash's surviving Rogues gallery embarks on a trip to Gorilla City for the purpose of knocking over Grodd's vault. Gorilla City is an old and storied setting dating all the way back to the early days of the Silver Age Flash, premiering in 1959. Since then it's been a DC staple, as well as a rolling retcon intended to tie together all of DC's mini-talking apes with a single shared origin. That explains the inclusion in this story of Sam Simeon, the titular ape from DC's Angel and the Ape, a private detective / comic book artist later retconned in the post-crisis era to be Grodd's grandson. I believe they scrambled this origin even further during the New 52, but considering how little of the New 52 is stuck around, it's possible that will never be mentioned again. Gorilla City here is a far cry from the futuristic utopia originally encountered by Barry Allen. This city's wealthy, yes, but riven by inequality, and ruled by Grodd as a boss in the mold of the Mafia. He controls the flow of capital, he's in charge of union hiring, he rips the heads off any humans who try to undercut that de facto monopoly on labor. So, the upside is that Gorilla City has a big fat bank filled with gold, but the downside is that it's protected by an army of mobbed-up gorillas with machine guns. The machinery of a heist caper switches into high gear as our gang sets about formulating a plan intended to get in and get out with all the gold they can carry. What they didn't plan on, however, was running into the aforementioned Sam Simeon, who recognizes Captain Cold and confronts him over the fact that he has no business being seen in that city. Another wrinkle comes with the unexpected, or at least unexpected to me, return of Cameron Chase as the DEO director who receives the unfortunate news about a clutch of rogues having broken Pearl and Keystone. That's a lot of moving parts to complicate the heist. Writer Josh O. Williamson understands the appeal of these stories lies in watching crooks construct a gorgeous plan and seeing it get broken piece by piece as it comes into contact with reality. Between Grodd, Sam Simeon, and Chase, the rogues have enough on their plates without having to worry about the fact that a couple of their number should probably not have been taken off their psychiatric medication, and a couple more seemingly only involved for family reasons. Stay tuned for everything to fall apart in the next issue, almost certainly. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Steel Town Rockers number 5 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. The drama continues following a wedding gig that sees the cast in rented tuxedos for the evening. Contrary to what you might have expected, the band has survived and come together as a cohesive unit. All well and good until Terry and Adora go off on their own after the show. What first seems a romantic motorcycle ride in the woods is derailed by the addition of cocaine, which inspires Terry to go nuts trying to climb onto a moving train. He's lucky he doesn't get his arm ripped off, but the band is still left wondering what to do about a drummer with his arm left in a cast. Meanwhile, the rest of the group is left eating drive-thru hamburgers and taking their tuxedos back to the wedding rental place. They'll let them borrow them in exchange for the keyboardist fixing their computer system. Eddie wins a pot of poker at work and even has the wherewithal to use the victory to get some free repairs for Johnny's busted car. The series manages to present a slice of these characters' lives without succumbing to cheap melodrama. Much of the character growth occurs off-panel, just like real high school. People change, friendships grow out of deep rivalries, jealousies and resentments fade with familiarity. With one issue left to go, it's important to re-emphasize this isn't like any other Marvel comic that has ever been printed. This is pure drama pulled more or less out of real life. A real life filled with poverty and failure, drugs and racism, hope and joy, all wrapped up in the indescribable jumble of growing up. As strange as it seems, this is the closest Marvel ever came to some kind of counter-programming for the alternative comics boom that produced work like Love and Rockets or the later Zot. I don't, however, need to look to know that the book met a muted response from that audience, as Marvel has never known how to sell comics to anyone outside its chosen demographic. However, worth pointing out, no Eisners were awarded in 1990, so it's fun to imagine they could have at least been nominated. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Rune number 3 from 1994 in Malibu Comics. Barry Windsor Smith's abbreviated opus about a lavender space vampire marches onwards, and this issue offers some exposition to contextualize what we've been seeing for the previous 2 issues. We learn more about the origins of the mysterious Genie supercomputer which Rune has infiltrated, how it was brought to America under the shadowy auspices of Project Blue Book, how years of research brought agonizingly slow progress towards understanding its otherworldly secrets, and how it was finally discovered that the cosmic power of Shu-Ji could only be wielded by genetic twins, which explains the existence of the ultra-powered twins who Rune began the series by wanting to eat. Well, Rune still wants to eat those twins, but now he understands more about why precisely eating them is so desirable. Now he wants the cosmic power of Shu-Ji all to himself. However, he also leaves his own magic runes inside Genie when he leaves to hunt, opening new possibilities for General Raider, who dreams of once again returning to humanity. A great deal of plot, which will soon be rendered rather moot, sadly, but for today I'd like to single out the coloring. Much has been made of how far ahead of their time Malibu's computer coloring actually was, and while the results could be mixed across the line, a book like Rune shows off the technology at its best, although there was still some confusion in terms of how dark computer color would print, a question that would bedevil computer coloring through the turn of the century. There's nonetheless a great deal of imagination on display here, using wild color effects to complement Windsor Smith's often abstract storytelling elements. Another interesting aspect of this issue is that it was published with 2 pages of creator testimonials, following the recent death of Jack Kirby. Now, there is another sad aspect of this book that must be discussed, as this comic marks the first appearance of one of the signature gimmicks for the Ultraverse line, the advent of Ultraverse Premiere. The Premiere was an anthology, a full-length book in the mold of Marvel Comics Presents, featuring 3 stories unconnected to the main feature. The Premiere would be attached to the back of the main comic in the style of a flip book, such that anyone buying Rune would be unavoidably on the hook for a double-sized issue filled with a bunch of stuff that was very much not Rune. Each issue of the Premiere was stapled to the back of a different comic. The second issue was attached to the back of Mantra, the third to Prime, and so forth. My recollection is that this was not a particularly popular gimmick. The most memorable aspect of this first issue of the Premiere was the presence of Derek Robertson, one of the most prolific pencilers of the early 90s, capable of producing monthly work for both Marvel and Malibu during the period. Just this month, cover dated March 1994, Robertson was also the credited penciler for New Warriors 45. His feature in the Premiere, however, is notable for another reason, being that Robertson also wrote his story, the first appearance of Ripfire, a guy who gets magic powers from a UFO that finds him when he's in the middle of the desert listening to Bad Religion on a boombox. The rest of the book features a solo turn from Mantra supporting Dude Warstrike, who very briefly granted his own book following this, but immediately preceding the implosion of the line, as well as Elvin, a moderately promising Prime spin-off featuring a character devoted to wreaking vengeance specifically upon men who hurt women. The Ultraverse Premiere only lasted 11 issues, mercifully. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Monster Menace #1 from 1993 in Marvel Comics. Marvel put out a lot of comics in '93, some of them better than others, but what I most appreciate about this era of the company's history was their robust reprint program. Spearheaded by editor Mort Todd, the company made a big push in these final days of newsstand distribution, with projects such as a series of one-shots dedicated to reprinting highlights from Tomb of Dracula, a mini-series devoted to the company's pre-horror called Curse of the Weird, and this companion series, Monster Menace, dedicated to Marvel's later 50s creature feature output. Although on the surface these might seem like harmless trifles, I'm taken of late by how dark these monster stories were in context. The 3 primary creatives, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko, had all recently suffered significant personal and professional setbacks, and these unassuming thrillers formed a creative lifeline for 3 men who were leaving the 1950s at a frightfully low ebb. Keep that in mind as you peruse these simple yarns. Ditko's Monster on Bald Mountain is about an ultimate battle between good and evil that erupts from the ambitions of an artist. Kirby's What Lurks on Channel X features an attempted alien invasion through mind control accidentally foiled by an officious landlord. These are stories cut to the bone, shorn of all elegance or pretense, unintentional exercises in minimalism. The highlight of the issue is The Terror of Timbu Ba, a formless masterclass with Ditko hewing to a rigid 9-panel regime to depict the rise and fall of an alien tyrant, a monster overcome not by heroism but pure puckish contingency. These stories are always more interesting to me than most readers seem to credit, and you can't argue with Todd's curatorial skills, especially not when the package comes wrapped in a cover by none other than the great Kyle Baker, and what the editorial informs us was his first comics work in 3 years. One of the best reprint packages Marvel has ever produced. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Spirit World #1 from DC Comics in 2023. I picked up this new debut for one reason. It's written by Alyssa Wong, the current writer for Marvel's Deadpool. I'm really enjoying their take on that character, and this looked decent based on a flip-through in the shop. So I took the plunge, and I'm glad I did. This is a very strong debut for new character Zhanti Zhu, spinning out of their first appearance in DC's recent Lazarus Planet crossover. The character's milieu is steeped in Chinese mythology and spirituality, opening up an entirely new part of the DC universe for exploration. In brief, Zhu is a spirit envoy, someone who specializes in helping the deceased get to their proper destinations, and who seems a lot more comfortable in the world of spirits than the worlds of men. Spirit World is ultimately concerned with the disposition of the Cassandra Cain Batgirl, fresh from her co-headlining role in Batgirls, a personal favorite series of mine, and stranded in the land of the dead by the events of the aforementioned Lazarus Planet. It's up to Zhu and Jean Constantine to save Cassie from the forces of the afterlife that don't take kindly to the imposition of the living, setting aside the fact that the series gives us John Constantine interacting with Batman supporting characters. That horse left the barn a long time ago. Now he just shows up during crossovers and everything. I really enjoyed this book, coming in cold after having noped out of Lazarus Planet. Wong's writing is complemented by the art of Hai Ning, a new name to me, who appears to be the real deal, someone with both a feel for background detail and easy-to-read action storytelling. The most pleasant surprise, however, is the appearance of the great Janice Chang on letters. Perhaps my favorite letterer growing up, and I am thrilled to see her still working today. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Amazing Spider-Man 25 from 2023 in Marvel Comics. Remember 2 days ago? Remember when everyone was upset about Paul? Remember Paul? This comic came out a week ago, and it's already been mooted in the discourse since I put this review on the schedule. That tells me they really must be doing a great job if everyone is so hyped, right? Well, I gotta say, as someone who is extraordinarily bullish about the beginning of this run on Amazing, it is not without a twinge of regret I report that the series has rather lost the plot. In all honesty, I don't really have a dog in the fight in regards to whatever Mary Jane ends up doing. She and Peter were married when I was a kid, but I'm not wedded to that idea enough to get bent out of shape about it. I like the Black Cat too, and I'm always happy to see her more prominent. What I don't understand is why they devoted 5 solid issues to telling this story. The answer to the mystery they've been teasing for literally a year turns out to be that Spider-Man was embroiled in a fantasy plot involving evil gods and dimensional portals. All the things I hate about contemporary Spider-Man stories. At the beginning of this run, it seemed as if writer Zeb Wells understood what was necessary for Spider-Man. Smaller scale stories about human-sized enemies, humor, and seeing Peter Parker get the living tar beat out of him on a regular basis. It's good for the soul to see Spider-Man get his ass kicked, but spending so much time, 5 issues, on a story about evil gods and mystic glyphs just makes me tired and cranky. Romita Jr. is joined here by Kari Andrews, a strange combo that doesn't quite fit but looks better than it could have. But then, this could have been a 2-parter, and it could have come a lot earlier in the book's run, because as it is, this just sapped all the forward momentum the book had. Coming on the heels of a frankly disappointing crossover, that makes for a fatal combination. With Paul, Marvel has committed the unenviable sin of reverse engineering Terry Long, a character hated by the fans to perhaps an irrational degree, but hated nonetheless. Paul's one advantage here over Dear Terry is that he doesn't appear to be such a blatant author insert character, although I suppose I could be mistaken there. The best story in the book isn't even by Zeb Wells, but Rainbow Rowell's Backup, drawn by Alvaro Lopez, which gives us Peter and Felicia on a weekend trip away from the city. It's always fun to see Spider-Man figure out how to get around in cities that don't have tall buildings. That's the kind of thing I want to see in a Spider-Man book. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Grimm's Ghost Stories number 18 from 1974 in Gold Key. I picked this up for $1 a while ago with no real expectation, and to my surprise, it was more engaging than I expected. Now, we don't have good records as to who wrote these stories, nor who lettered or colored them. ThatComics.org has artist credits at all is perhaps as good as we could hope for. One noticeable elision for Gold Key was the lack of the comics code. No kind of rebellion, rather a lingering after effect of the company having inherited much of the old Dell operation. Dell never ran the code either. They considered their proximity to Disney to be sufficient guarantee, and they were right about that. And when Gold Key carried over in 1962, they continued the practice. The first story here is about the son of a Confederate widow and Civil War historian, driven by the question as to whether her mother's wartime suitor died a hero or a coward by his own hand. Surprisingly, the story reveals the latter, presenting an anti-euphemistic rebuttal to the lost cause apologia I wincingly expected from the first panel. Admittedly, nothing else in the book is quite that level of hardcore. The second feature, about a husband and wife team of servants who die in a car crash and leave their abusive boss bereft, ends with them returning to torment him from beyond the grave. One of 2 stories this issue featuring on-panel car accidents quite prominently. The final story, while not the spookiest, is the best looking. Prolific Argentinian artist Luis Dominguez illustrates a story from just prior to the English Civil War, about a ne'er-do-well prodigal son who returns from beyond the grave to save his father from being trampled by a wild boar. Absolutely no one would mistake this for EC, or even DC's contemporary horror line, but for a third string horror book, it didn't pull a lot of punches. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Rogues number 3 from 2022 in DC's Black Label. The heist gets underway and things go more than a little pear-shaped for our intrepid gang of crooks. When last we left the Rogues, Captain Cold had just been pinched by Sam Simeon, the titular ape from Angel and the Ape. This issue picks up with Cold being given the hard sell by Sam in regards to his own schemes for the future of Gorilla City, essentially a gangster town that runs on profits from the illicit drug trade. For all his pretensions as a conqueror, Grodd is ultimately revealed to be just another another crook, an ape with no compunctions about using the resources of his people to further his personal wealth. As expected, things start going badly for the rogues as soon as their plan comes into contact with reality, with both their exit plan scotched and their heavy hitters out of commission sooner rather than later. The most impressive aspect of Rogues, and the reason I recommend the story so highly, is the work of Italian cartoonist Leo Max, surely among the very best-looking art jobs to come out of the company in a good long time. The album format gives the art room to shine. The extra real estate gives the artist room to spread their wings. The Rogues' assault on the bank vault is an excellent, thrilling sequence, unfolding on the page with the precision of a metronome. But the real highlight here is Leo Max's gift for expression. Every page simply a sublime masterclass in communicating emotion and character through facial movements. That he manages to do this with a cast partially composed of talking gorillas is all the more impressive. This book is simply a pleasure to read. Pay especial attention to Golden Glider, a character both beautiful and emotive, whose reactions carry a great deal of narrative weight. She makes a perfect foil for her brother, whose resting expression throughout remains a dark scowl. Colorist Jason Wordie also deserves special commendation for his work. Every scene and every character is given their own palette, switching up throughout the book in a way that feels both organic and imaginative. This is a book defined above all else by a careful, scrupulous attention to detail. Everything fits, everything works. Just a gorgeous book from first to last, beautiful and measured, even when the bodies inevitably start hitting the floor. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Steeltown Rockers number 6 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. The saga of the Steeltown Rockers comes to an end, a noble experiment and a tantalizing road not taken for mainstream comics. This final issue is concerned with the aftermath of Terry's terrible behavior. Ed's dad finds Terry's coke and comes down like a ton of bricks on his son. Meanwhile, Jason's dad finds his stolen artwork at a local comic convention. Turns out Terry was a bit of a trust-fund brat, a thief and an addict whose dad blames the rest of the band when he has to send Terry off to military school. Of course, without a drummer, they're up the proverbial creek, until Johnny gets his bike stolen and the bicycle thief turns out to be a percussive prodigy. It's not a clean ending, really, and it hardly ends with groundbreaking success, but it ends with the Rockers accepting a gig as the Friday night house band for a dive bar called The Dive Bar, which features mud wrestling on Saturdays. The story ends not with a climactic breakup or a crushing failure, but on a note of hope. The Steeltown Rockers haven't appeared in 33 years, save for a mention in an issue of Moon Knight years later that confirmed they went on to record at least one album, as well as an appearance as a band poster on an episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., confirming that the band exists in at least one small corner of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as well. Steeltown Rockers may not have made an impact, but it deserves to be remembered as a truly groundbreaking book for its time. It just wasn't ground the company particularly cared to have broken. A series in severe need of rediscovery and reappraisal, maybe even a new printing. Elaine Lee and Steve Leialoha deserve all the accolades we can muster. It's never too late to recover a masterpiece. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Rune number 4 from 1994 in Malibu Comics. Barry Windsor Smith's great contribution to the Ultraverse continues as Rune's plans come one step closer to fruition. Turns out it wasn't such a great idea for Aladdin to bring Rune back to their secret base, because he spends much of this issue wrecking the joint and killing everyone he finds. Among that number happens to be the other half of the psychic twins he's been tracking down since the first issue. About the only person on the base he doesn't expressly want to kill, but only because he'll be a better meal once he finds his psychic twin and they activate each other's powers. If you've read Weapon X or Monsters, you might have an inkling what to expect here. Lots and lots of men with guns, either running towards or running away from the dark god of the void, as he moves through the staff of the installation like a hot knife through butter. General Stryker almost succeeds in stealing Rune's own magical runes for the purpose of regenerating his own body, but then Rune doubles back, finds Stryker, and tears him apart again for having the gall to try to steal his power. Basically, Rune comes unhinged. Pure power, pure appetite, pure kinetic destructive force, unleashed on those who have themselves used their own power to manipulate and destroy. As good as he is at detail and filigree, it's also necessary to remember Windsor Smith excels at action, at brutal violence and bloody gore, at movement that goes faster with every turn of the page. Rune may be, in the final estimate, a tantalizingly brief work, unfairly truncated by circumstances, marooned by history, but in its visceral brevity, we nevertheless see unmistakable kinship to the strongest chapters of the Master's bibliography. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Black Hawk 263 from 1983 in DC Comics. Inexplicably, the early 80s was a strong period for DC's wartime staple. Having dusted off the book the previous year, the team of Mark Evanier and Dan Spiegel wiped the slate as close to back to basics as possible. Gone were the superpowers of the Silver Age or the regrettable costumes of the Bronze, and in their place was a return to fundamentals, a book about a team of Nazi-smashing aviators operating in wartime Europe. This was also the period Steven Spielberg's name was improbably linked in development of a Black Hawk feature film for many years, the kind of attention that certainly didn't hurt during a period when war books in general were on the wane. But the fact is, regardless of the circumstances of miraculous resurrection, Black Hawk was one of the handsomest books on the shelves for the entirety of its revival. Dan Spiegel doesn't get the credit he deserves for being a true craftsman's craftsman, a storyteller in the mold of Toth, with credits dating back to the late 40s. As for the story, it's got two tracks. In the first, the Black Hawks, without their leader, have to defeat the nefarious war wheel, one of Germany's deadliest weapons and one of the Black Hawks' most stubborn antagonists since 1952. The second plot, however, features a standout villain from the 80s revival, the femme fatale Domino, a seductive assassin working directly for Der Fuhrer, whose deadly efficiency is compromised only when she falls for Black Hawk himself. These truly star-crossed lovers meet in Marrakesh in what could only be a pointed homage to one of the greatest movies ever put to film. Of course, the affair ends poorly. How else could it, leaving Black Hawk alive, but much the worse for wear. And don't skip the essay in the back featuring Evanier's thoughts on the subject of updating racially insensitive material for a contemporary audience, a sadly evergreen dispute. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marvel's recent facsimile edition of Avengers #1 from 1963. If you only know the Avengers' origin from other media, it might surprise you to learn just how weird their first adventure actually is. Although the cover promises a showdown between five of Marvel's most notable headliners and Loki, the god of mischief, in execution the story's nowhere near that straightforward. Loki's overly complicated plan begins when he sets out to frame the Hulk for trying to demolish a passenger train. In response to this calumny, the Hulk's friends in the Teen Brigade spring into action, the Teen Brigade being a gang of ham radio operators led by the Hulk's one actual friend, Rick Jones. The Teen Brigade first tries to contact the Fantastic Four, but Loki intercepts the signal, given that he had no appetite to involve anyone who was going to see through his ruse. Loki wants Thor because the whole point of the exercise is getting Thor to fight the Hulk. But he's not being careful because he accidentally nets Iron Man as well as Ant-Man and the Wasp, who all head on down to the Southwest for the purpose of hunting the Hulk, who is actually undercover in a traveling circus pretending to be a robot clown named Meccano. There's a great deal of imagination on display from Lee and Kirby on every page here, but it's not necessarily going in the direction you expect. The problem of the Avengers wasn't that they needed to have a good origin, but simply that they needed an excuse to put all of these people in the same room together for the first time. Avengers #1 accomplishes that goal as efficiently as they could figure at the time by bringing everyone together to fight the Hulk until it's time to stop fighting the Hulk. Perfunctory? Yes, of course. There's a whole lot of plate spinning and endless contrivance. The book gets better, yes, and it doesn't even take long. But never forget, the Avengers came together, at least in part, because the Hulk thought pretending to be a robot clown was the right move. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Batman Legends of the Dark Knight Annual #7 from 1997 in DC Comics. DC maintained theme releases for their annuals all through the 90s, with greater or lesser degrees of success depending on your perspective. 1997 represented one of the more interesting years for this initiative. The theme was Pulp Heroes, and every annual presented some kind of spin on a genre that had been a staple of the pulps 60 or 70 years prior. In practice, that meant DC's mainline heroes being plugged into retro-leaning suspense stories with a noir flavor, or weird westerns, or globe-trotting adventures. In the case of this Legends of the Dark Knight Annual, the creators insert Batman into a mystery involving World War I biplanes and the lost treasure of Lieutenant Steve Savage. If that name seems familiar, you might have more than a passing familiarity with DC's war books, because Steve Savage was also known as the Balloon Buster. First appearing in All-American Men of War #112, the Balloon Buster was created by Robert Conagher and Russ Heath in 1965. Given that, it might not surprise you to hear the book was written by James Robinson during the zenith of popularity for his Starman. That book was renowned for returning and recontextualizing material from the company's golden and silver ages to the then-current post-crisis continuity, and so too here with this Batman Annual, a giant-sized issue partly dedicated to telling the story of Balloon Buster's final days in the war and what became of him after. Fittingly, the middle stretch of the book is illustrated by none other than Heath himself, returning to draw 17 pages of high-flying action from the Great War, including the final tragedy of Savage's great wartime love, Rochelle. Of course, any story with Batman in a biplane immediately draws comparisons to another famous Bat yarn, Death Flies the Haunted Sky from 1970 in Detective Comics 442, one of the most striking Batman stories of all time, drawn by Alex Toth. Just as that earlier story provided Batman a connection to the company's notorious World War I German fighter pilot Hans von Hammer, so too does Robinson's Annual provide a coda of sorts to the life of one of the company's less celebrated military characters. But the book doesn't just look good for Heath's involvement, although that's certainly the above-the-fold credit here. The rest of the book is drawn by British comics veteran Steve Yowell, mainstay of 2000 AD and frequent collaborator with Grant Morrison. Although Yowell and Heath are, on the face of it, dissimilar artists, they meet somewhere in the middle here, a clear and technically stunning narrative featuring Batman playing someone against type, set down in the quiet countryside to solve a mystery under the clear blue sky. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Uncle Scrooge Adventures number 5 from 1988 in Gladstone Comics. No publisher looms larger in the comics of my youth than Gladstone. Although the company's first incarnation really only lasted a few years, their Disney books were crucial in getting me hooked on the medium at a tender age. Gladstone took their business seriously, probably in hindsight a bit too serious for kids' comics sold at the 7-Eleven. They had no ads except for other Gladstone products, mostly expensive reprint albums, and just about every issue came with text pieces, filled with historical provenance and trivia. One thing this run of titles did above all else was emphasize the importance of creators. If Carl Barks' name never appeared on any of the comics for which he is lauded, Gladstone made up for that by building their entire publishing line around reverence for creators such as Barks, as well as Floyd Gottfredson and Al Taliaferro, and even newer talent like William Van Horn and Don Rosa. It's that last name that produced our book today. In '88, Rosa was still a newcomer to the Ducks, his first Scrooge story having seen print just the year prior. By the time Last Sled to Dawson saw print in the spring of '88, there was no doubt whatsoever that Rosa was something special indeed. I was just a kid at the time, and even I could tell that the Rosa stories, though they were new, were nevertheless a cut above almost anything else, walking in Barks' footsteps but not slavishly. Last Sled is a direct sequel to Barks' own Back to the Klondike, but not a carbon copy. His idiosyncratic, highly detailed illustration retains throughout one foot in the fanzine culture from which he sprang, marking him as a peer to contemporary fan artists such as Fred Hembeck and Scott McCloud. Rosa would build a significant body of work in his own right, all still in print in gorgeous album format, courtesy today not of Gladstone, but Fantagraphics. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Rogues number 4 from DC Comics Black Label in 2022. And so the story ends. Without going into over much detail about the actual plot passing before your eyes, it shouldn't be a surprise at this point to learn that the story doesn't end well for our merry rogues. Probably to be expected. The one last heist genre is familiar, after all. If we know it's the old gang's last ride, we can't be surprised when the story starts playing for keeps. The Flash doesn't stop by to help wrap everything in a neat bow. Captain Cold's plan goes south and the bodies start piling up in short order. What pathos emerges does so because we recognize that we are seeing broken creatures, literally unable to function outside the role of defiant outlaw, spitting in the eye of authority out of pure spite. I can't help wonder if Rogues was hurt by its timing, coming out during the same window as not just Catwoman, Lonely City, but Wonder Woman Historia, not one but two significant books destined for perpetuity on the strength of career best work from comics veterans. Rogues is a scrappy book by nature, and it couldn't but fly under the radar in that August company. It maybe didn't help that the Catwoman book was premised on a similar kind of one last heist plotline. Certainly the books share some similarities in terms of premise, but there's no doubt which book approaches the subject with a nasty gimlet eye, shorn of any real sentimentality. What sentiment the book has is of the most desperate kind. Golden Glider pleading with her sociopathic brother not to descend to the level of murdering children, a line below which even the woman who slit people's throats with ice skates won't sink. It ends the only way it could. Cold versus Grodd, the two biggest bastards in Flash's Rogues Gallery, who aren't actually serial killers, just two mean SOBs who don't really have anything in common except they couldn't think of a better way to die than pissing each other off. Williamson and Leo Max have really put together a very special book here, one I sincerely believe will build its audience in collected form. It's just too handsome of a book, with every page just about offering some kind of delight from Leo Max's pencil. I was taken throughout by his Golden Glider, for instance, an improbably beautiful woman smack in the middle of the most sordid circumstances imaginable by virtue of being unable to extricate herself from her toxic brother's orbit. As far as Leo Max goes, I'm a certified fan going forward. The man can draw like a house on fire. He can draw pretty girls, and he can draw brutish apes, and he can even draw brutish men and pretty apes. He frankly seems like he can draw just about anything. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the first issue of Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja from 1989 in Marvel Comics. Perhaps you've never heard of the Nth Man, or perhaps you've heard it referred to condescendingly, grouped alongside other such oddities as US 1 or NFL Super Pro. Do not doubt this strange book is one of the most interesting experiments in Marvel history. Nth Man is the brainchild of Larry Hama, longtime Marvel editor and mastermind behind the company's epical G.I. Joe comic, as well as a considerable stretch writing Wolverine. The subject here is nothing less than World War III, the climactic confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. That apocalyptic tension was front and center in people's minds throughout the 1980s. Certainly, Hama's run on G.I. Joe profited immensely from the looming shadow of that theoretical conflict. Unlike Joe, however, this book didn't need to mask those fears with toyetic euphemism. The catalyst for World War III in the universe of the Nth Man is actually a familiar trope from the era. There's precisely one superpowered individual in this world, an unbalanced psychic named Alfie Omegan. That's the kind of bad pun you should expect from any Hama book, if you're not familiar. And with the power of his mind, Alfie has rendered inert every nuclear weapon on the planet. Removing mutually assured destruction from the equation triggers instantaneous conflict. So yes, right off the bat we find ourselves in the neighborhood of Watchmen and Akira, similar stories defined by unbalanced individuals of great power, conceived in the anxious shadow of an impossible war. And in this morass we find John Doe, the titular Ultimate Ninja. Any similarities to Remo Williams was surely coincidental, considering both characters possess near superhuman fighting abilities gained under the tutelage of a gruff Asian martial arts master. Hama's preoccupation with the internal politics of ninja clans was a defining obsession of the 1980s, building on Frank Miller's Daredevil to give the world the likes of Snake Eyes, Storm Shadow, and the Ashikaga clan. John Doe is cut from that same cloth, the crucial difference being that the Nth Man, being the Ultimate Ninja, also sports a mullet. As an artifact of the very end of the Cold War, Nth Man is uniquely fascinating. Of course, no one in this country knew just how close to dissolution the Soviet Union was at the time. Dramatic irony that casts its own shadow. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Rune number 5 from Malibu Comics in 1994. The first and only real arc for Rune wraps up here, although the character would continue for a few years and even receive a bit of spotlight after the Marvel acquisition. There's no doubt that the most interesting aspect of the book and character was the involvement of his creator, Barry Windsor Smith. After this, Windsor Smith would go on to do only one more issue of the regular series and a bare handful of other pieces, an annual, a Conan crossover, and a couple covers. That's it. What's more, the issue wastes precious Windsor Smith drawing time by laying groundwork for the line's first major crossover, Breakthrough, featuring all the main characters convening for a brawl on the moon at the behest of the alien supercomputer woken by the events here, all of which seems in hindsight quite useless given the speed with which the line disintegrated, a process sadly already in evidence before the Marvel takeover. But here at least we get some small closure with the end of Rune's first great saga. His interference has destroyed decades of work on the part of secret government agencies, but Rune doesn't care at all. What matters to him is that he succeeded in creating a living god solely for the purpose of draining that god's power and curing his own cancer. He is restored by arcane energies to the prime of his power and flies off into the rainy night, vowing to suck the marrow from the bones of that god on their next meeting. Improbably, this is still excellent. Tear out every bit of Ultraverse lore and you're left with a chilling portrait of Rune as the most evil creature to ever live. I just wish there were more than a couple Rune stories that weren't absolutely terrible. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Arak, Son of Thunder 37 from 1984 in DC Comics. Few things in comics have given me more joy of late than finding treasure hoards of Bronze Age fantasy comics, thick on the ground and priced to sell. One of my favorite discoveries has been Arak, Son of Thunder. Now almost completely forgotten, the series lasted a full 50 issues in the early 80s. Created by the team of Roy Thomas and Ernie Colon in 1981, Arak details the history of an interesting warrior, a Native American orphan raised by Vikings. Arak travels not through any fantasy realm or distant prehistory, but through the real world and its real history. Early in the series, he befriends Charlemagne, to give you an idea of the era, and much of the book is devoted to political intrigue between real historical entities. This story begins, for instance, with Arak musing in a tavern in Damascus on the subject of his lover, the Frankish shield maiden Valda, long removed but never far from his thoughts. Issue 37 is a spotlight on Valda, featuring the impulsive, occasionally reckless warrior woman fending off a conspiracy to have her married to a loutish Mercian nobleman. Although he was no longer the series' regular artist, this issue features the return of Colon for a special story. It would also turn out to be Colon's last appearance in the book, and it's a simply gorgeous art job all around. He's inking himself here, and I find his perfectly measured, yet ingratiatingly casual line work to be endlessly engrossing. Although Arak's modern appearances have been unfortunately mired in the quagmire of Convergence, Valda has fared somewhat better, appearing as a member of the Shadow Pact, in addition to a recent appearance in Steve Orlando's Wonder Woman, which featured Valda getting tanked and wrecking a bar in Boston. And then, of course, there's the matter of the Valda spin-off miniseries that was supposed to have been drawn by a certain Todd McFarlane. Promo art exists, but nothing more, a tantalizing taste of one of the more interesting lost projects in comics history.